Okay, welcome to today's webinar on migrant worker recruitment in Malaysia and why this topic matters for public buyers. This is the fifth free webinar in a series of socially responsible public procurement intended primarily for public buyers. So a few logistical points before we get started. Excuse me while I handle my own logistics here. As you will have noticed by now, all participants are on mute for the sake of sound quality. But we encourage you to think about questions and comments that you may have during the presentations that you will hear. And if you have any, then please send a chat message as a question occurs to you to Martina Hooper, who will coordinate the questions and answers and read them after the presentations. Please use the private chat function rather than a chat to everyone. If you can, also state who your question is for or who your comment is for. And as Martina mentioned, you can also raise technical questions with her through the private chat function during the course of the presentations. I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available through the Electronics Watch website on the events section after this webinar. And before I move on to other things, Martina, are there other logistical points that should be made? Remind people to connect to audio. Anything else?
I don't think so, no. If there are any technical issues in the invitation email, the confirmation email there are telephone numbers that you can use to dial in if you do have any internet issues. Good.
Okay, first a quick word about Electronics Watch before we get going with today's presentation. Electronics Watch is an independent monitoring organization that helps public sector organizations work together to protect the rights of workers in their electronics supply chain. And we do this in collaboration with civil society monitoring partners and experts who are located in the regions where electronics is produced through the worker-driven monitoring methodology. More than 300 public sector organizations in 7 countries are affiliates to Electronics Watch and share the cost of monitoring electronic supply chains and coordinate engagement with industry through Electronics Watch to lower cost and maximize impact. And in collaboration with monitoring partners in over 11 countries, we have seen direct improvements on conditions in factories employing tens of thousands of workers altogether on issues ranging from forced labor to wages and working hours. So the affiliate network here are marked in blue, whereas the monitoring partners are located in the green areas of this map. We have long recognized that migrant worker recruitment is a key issue to understand for public buyers, as this is linked to risk of debt bondage and forced labor, particularly when workers have to pay to get a job. Recognizing this, Electronics Watch has developed guidance for remediation and prevention of migrant worker recruitment fees and related costs in public procurement. And this guidance is available on our website, and we will discuss it later on in this presentation as well. So education is vital to this process of socially responsible public procurement, and this webinar series sheds light on some key issues. Previous webinars, for example, have addressed supply chain transparency, responsible mining, the risk of employee suicides in the electronics sector in China, and health and safety issues. And again, all these webinars are available at the Electronics Watch website in the event section of the website. And already next week, mark your calendars again if you haven't already. On June 4th, we're doing another one in this series, and this one will address a very interesting topic of worker voices in public procurement. What's the possibilities for public buyers actually to create more freedom for worker voices in their supply chain? And so over to today's presentation. I have the great pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Joseph Paul is a director with Tenaganita in Malaysia, a human rights organization founded in 1999 that works with migrant workers, refugees, and victims of human trafficking. Dealing with issues relating to migrant workers, refugees, and human trafficking, Joseph Paul has worked extensively on migrant worker issues, handling cases involving fraud and deception in recruitment, non-payment of wages, arbitrary dismissal, arrest and detention, and a host of other violations. Joseph also does advocacy for changes in immigration policies and practices, and for a rational national policy for the recruitment and management of migrant workers. And our second presenter today is Andy Hall, who is a migrant worker rights specialist. And he is also a globally recognized human rights defender, a migrant worker rights specialist and campaigner working on migrant worker rights, empowerment, and modern-day slavery issues in global supply chains, particularly with impoverished and exploited migrant workers from Myanmar historically, but also in all regions, Nepal, Bangladesh, Indonesia, which Andy will tell you about shortly. Andy also works as a consultant to Electronics Watch and has led the Electronics Watch research on migrant worker recruitment issues in Malaysia. And at this point, Martina, can you let us, we know that Joseph Paul had some sound problems earlier. Does Joseph have sound right now?
I think he's still trying to sort it out. He still doesn't have sound, I'm afraid.
Okay. In that case, we will go directly to Andy's presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so Andy, you can share yours.
Okay, can you hear me, yeah?
We can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, I just put the slideshow on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay. So thank you, Bjorn, for introducing me. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the issue of migrant worker recruitment, and then talk a little bit about the work that Electronics Watch has been doing in this area recently. I've been doing it as a consultant, but as Bjorn said, I'm also an independent migrant worker specialist. So the first thing is, why is this ethical or zero cost recruitment actually important? So at the moment, we have a big debate globally about forced labor. And in the context of the Customs and Border Protection Department in the US enforcing conditions, and then a due diligence debate, modern slavery debate. And we have a lot of principles that were recently issued by leading governments related to public procurement, actually, the UK government, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, about modern slavery, trying to ensure that there's no forced labor in supply chains, public procurement supply chains. And so we're moving beyond the traditional social auditing standards, looking at labor rights and human rights, to this issue of migrant worker recruitment, also like things like the living wage, which are becoming more important. And we have the ILO's indicators on forced labor that have been published, talking about, the fact that forced labor, an indicator is things like debt bondage or limited freedom of movement. So migrant worker recruitment has become quite a big issue, because there are a lot of risks of forced labor, which link in with issues of modern day slavery. So when we talk about recruitment, we talk about zero cost recruitment, and we also talk about ethical recruitment of migrant workers. Zero cost essentially means that the worker doesn't have to pay to get a job, whereas ethical recruitment is much broader. Ethical recruitment means that the recruitment process is transparent, consensual, there's no forced labor. It's a confidential process with personal information, and it's also a rights-based process. So it means that from the time when the worker is recruited in their origin country to the time they go to the destination country, to the time they work and then go home, the whole process is transparent, consensual. They know what job they're doing, they know what kind of work conditions they're in, etc., etc. So zero cost recruitment, which a lot of people are talking about now, the employer pays principle, is just one part of ethical recruitment. Ethical recruitment is a much broader term. And so if we look at ethical recruitment standards, particularly related to the electronics industry, in 2015, they had the EICC Code of Conduct, which has now become the RBA, the Responsible Business Alliance of Code of Conduct. And in 2015, they published this Code of Conduct, and they created a definition of recruitment-related costs and fees that workers shouldn't be paying to get jobs into the electronics industry. And this was quite an advanced definition, whereby the worker really didn't have to pay anything, even passport costs, transport costs. Everything related to recruitment was to be covered by the employer in the electronics industry. And a lot of the companies signed up, obviously, to that Code of Conduct. And then after that, we had companies like Apple, HP, who were developing actual policies and responses to that EICC Code of Conduct. And so, for instance, if we look at quite a few of the major electronics companies, including Apple and HP, they actually have zero cost or recruitment policies, or some kind of ethical recruitment policies, not fully ethical recruitment policies, but they have some level of ethical recruitment policies. And we've seen now a global development of the employer pays principle, whereby the employer should pay all the costs for recruitment. And then in 2019, we had the ILO published a tripartite agreed definition of recruitment-related costs and fees. And we've also seen a lot of movement in the US recently by the government to mandate that in public procurement supply chains, the workers shouldn't have to pay fees. So I just put up there the ILO forced labor indicators. These are the indicators of a worker being in a situation of forced labor. And you'll see, for instance, the abuse of vulnerability, deception, restriction of movement, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, retention of identity documents, withholding of wages, debt bondage, abusive working and living conditions, and excessive overtime. So there's a lot of those indicators that could be present when a worker is facing some kind of unethical recruitment. So why did Electronics Watch and working alongside me, why did we start to investigate this issue of recruitment into the electronics, or particularly the ICT industry? We had a lot of suspicions about this implementation of the ethical recruitment standard and the challenges of the EIC Code of Conduct from 2015, how it was being implemented, because there was a lot of companies that were saying that they were doing ethical recruitment. But from 2016 to 2018, Electronics Watch worked on a case in Thailand, which we published, and I put the link there, which was a case of workers having to pay a lot of money for ethical recruitment. And actually, until today, we still haven't managed to really make that much progress on that case. There's been a lot of improvements, but the workers have not been remedied yet. And that was a HP factory, Western Digital factory, a Seagate factory. We put a lot of effort, both our Electronics Watch working with RBA and working with the companies to try to address that. And we're still facing challenges. So we kind of felt that maybe this concept of ethical recruitment or employer pays was not so clear in implementation. And then also we were engaging, or I personally was engaging with Nepali and Myanmar recruitment agencies, both in Nepal where I live and also in Myanmar where I spent a lot of the last decade or so. And the agencies were telling me about a lot of difficulties they were having with the electronics companies in Malaysia and in Thailand. The impracticalities of their approaches, their own lack of capacity and their lack of ability to recruit workers and avoid like community broker systems. And they were also talking about these self-assessment questionnaires that were being given by big electronics companies and audits that the companies were doing, which they really felt were not really effective. And so, they started to talk a lot about how actually they were doing this ethical recruitment for the electronics industry, zero cost recruitment in theory, but in practice, they really weren't doing it. So we decided to investigate. So in 2018 and 2019, I was in Malaysia and I interviewed workers, more than 200 migrant workers in 17 electronics factories that supply to the ICT sector. Some of the factories, there was only a few workers interviewed, some were 30 or more. And it was large to medium-sized electronics facilities producing ICT equipment within the definition of the work of Electronics Watch. And there was a range of responses from the migrant workers. Actually, some of them reported that they didn't pay any costs or fees to me when I interviewed them on street corners outside their accommodation in restaurants. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't pay anything, because it was very difficult to build up networks with these workers. I was meeting them in public places, and the civil society wasn't able to facilitate my going in to meet workers in a situation where they had a lot of trust in the person that they were meeting. And also, you know, we found out that a lot of workers have to sign affidavits, and also they're videoed when they leave their origin country saying that they haven't paid fees. And they have a lot of like psychological threats or even physical threats if they were to admit to their employer in the destination country that they've actually paid fees. So some of the workers, as I said, they said they didn't pay any fees. It was really zero cost, but we have to question whether the data was really reliable or not. But what we did find with most of the workers that we interviewed, and these were migrants from Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Indonesia, is that they paid from $800 to $5,000 or more in recruitment-related costs and fees to get a job in the ICT electronics industry. The money was paid to syndicates of corrupt government officials, particularly in Bangladesh and Malaysia, and also agents and sub-agents. And there was no clear cost breakdown of what they'd paid or receipts of what they'd paid. So these are huge amounts of money that the workers are paid. And we found that the workers were in situations at high risk of forced labor, and they were trapped in poor working conditions. So there was clearly debt bondage for many of the workers. They'd sold, for instance, animals, buffaloes, cows, land, property, to pay the fees to get the job in Malaysia. And perhaps they were promised a lot different to what they got. And some of them had took out a lot of loans from local cooperatives or banks at very high interest rates. Sometimes the interest rates were up to 12, 13, 14% per month. In some of the cases also there was clearly deceit. So the workers were not only deceived about how much they would be earning, but the kind of work they would be doing, the place they would be, the situation they would be in, the living conditions they would be in. So when we have that element of deceit, we can also move from situations of forced labor actually into situations of human trafficking. The workers had limited freedom of movement. They couldn't resign. Most of them said that they couldn't resign, both for financial reasons and for cultural reasons. Many of them said that if they were to resign, they would have to pay back a levy that the company paid to the government. They would have to pay back recruitment fees that the company had expended on them, and they would have to pay penalties. And others said they couldn't resign for cultural reasons, because if they were to go back to their origin country without having paid off their debts or earn a lot of money to buy a house or buy a new property or show people that they'd actually succeeded in their life, it would be quite shameful for them. And also almost all of the workers that we met didn't have a passport in their own hands. Their passport was confiscated or held by a company or an agent, and they couldn't get access to that passport. And I'm not going to talk about the other labour and human rights violations, but there was quite a lot of challenges related to, for instance, the inability of workers to earn living wage, excessive overtime, and other limitations that they faced in their workplace, including occupational health safety issues. And so what we found is that the lower wages that were paid to migrants, they were paid lower wages to migrants than to the unreliable local workers. And so the migrants were controlled, or they remained in the work. You know, if you were to pay a local worker the amount that you were paying the migrant workers, they just wouldn't stay. They would always be moving to another job. Whereas if you pay, if you'd have to pay the local workers more to do the work. But the migrant workers were paid less, and they really couldn't go anywhere because of the situation that I described, because of the debt bondage, because of the passport confiscation, because of the limits on freedom of movement. So that was why the workers were staying in those jobs. And we also found that there was limited remediation reported. The ethical recruitment principle is that if a worker has to pay fees, then they should be paid them back once they arrive. We've found very few examples of workers having been remediated, but we did find some examples within, for instance, Apple's supply chain of cases where workers said they were paid back the fees that they'd paid because it was a company that was in Apple's supply chain. So why is this unethical recruitment happening in the first place? Well, a lot of people, they have this misplaced blaming only on the origin country recruitment processes. So they say that actually it's all about the origin country. Myanmar, Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, they say these are very undeveloped countries and they cannot control the process, and the workers are being fleeced in their home country. But actually that is a
Andy, you've cut off. We can't hear you, Andy. Sorry, I think Andy's just having a few some sound issues.
Okay, Martina, while we're waiting for Andy to regain sound, Andy, do you you can perhaps send a chat to Martina to explain what's going on? And Martina, why don't we, there's been a lot of substance in Andy's presentation already here.
Yeah.
Why don't we just see if people have comments or questions already at this point? And maybe we can generate some discussion while waiting for Andy to rejoin us. And I assume that Joseph is not also has sound problems.
Yeah, we're not having a very good day.
Okay.
Joseph is able to hear us, and for some reason he's not been able to get his sound to work yet.
Okay. I saw that Joseph's computer crashed in a very untimely way. Okay, now we don't have, Andy is not sharing anymore. Let's see.
I imagine Andy will log off and log back on
Okay.
if he's having some sort of issues like that.
I would suggest then we are, that perhaps we can generate some kind of a discussion before Andy wants to join back in. Maybe he is there. But please feel free. I think participants can unmute themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, they should be able to unmute themselves if they want to make comments or ask questions directly. I've got a couple of questions already that I can ask now if you want. Or should we
see if anybody can answer it, but sure. Anybody else? Just hold 2 seconds. See if anybody wants to make a comment verbally.
Yeah.
Andy's writing, I think, in the chat.
Yeah, we cannot hear you, Andy. Let me ask anybody online if I can ask a question to participants instead. Are you familiar with the issues around debt bondage, risk of forced labor among migrant workers in Malaysia, particularly perhaps in other countries? And if so, as a public sector organization of public buyers, would you like to discuss any steps that you have taken to meet those challenges or that you plan to take? So the floor is really open to anybody here. We will improvise a little bit since both our presenters are having technical problems. Or alternatively, you can just say, what do you think the challenges are and what do you think you would like to be able to do, but perhaps you can't do yet?
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes. Hi, welcome back, Andy.
I've got no idea what happened, yeah?
No worries. You're back in.
So where did you get to with my presentation? Maybe I should...
Yeah, we didn't continue your presentation while you were there. I think we are on the slides that you are showing right now. I was asking a question of participants, and since you're back, let's hold it for the end. But I was asking participants if they would want to think about how they have addressed the issues that you're describing in their own procurement, or how they would like to, what they see the challenges are for themselves. But it's just you finish your presentation, and then we can have a discussion on that topic.
Can you just tell me the last thing that you heard before I got cut off?
7th, I think. 7th, the page.
This page, yeah?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so I was talking about how the recruitment costs actually flow backwards from a worker to a company. So a worker pays the fees to a sub-agent who passes them on to an agent in the origin country, and then that money is then transferred across the border to an agent in the destination country, in this case Malaysia or Thailand. And some of that money is then shared actually with the company or the HR department of a company. So we say that the money is flowing backwards. Okay, sorry. The money is flowing backwards from a worker to a company. So when we say that this is a problem of origin country, and we blame the agents in the origin country, or we blame the sub-agents, actually we're not really understanding the process, because my research would suggest that actually those agents in the origin country are having to pay a lot of money to agents in the destination country, or also having to share this money with actually corrupt officials in the government, or even human resources. So there's a lot of kickbacks and corruption involving companies, recruitment agents, brokers, government officials. And it's not just in the origin country, it's also in the destination country. And we also find that companies have limited capacity and or interest on issues of recruitment. So a lot of companies have always actually traditionally, and I found this in a decade of working in Thailand, they just focused on the four walls of the factory. So, you know, is there child labor? Are there safety conditions? Are the workers being paid the minimum wage? And they still have limited capacity to actually go beyond the four walls of that factory. And increasingly companies are realizing that they can't just focus within the company, because the situation which the worker is recruited in can mean they end up in the company without their passport or in debt bondage. And that then has an impact on the company itself. So we're moving beyond the four walls of the factory back to the origin country. And that is an issue which we also have with audits, because audits essentially only focus on the destination country. They're not traditionally looked back at the conditions in which a worker was recruited in the origin country. Okay, so what is the way ahead? Well, as Bjorn said, we have an electronics watch guidance document, which I've put the link up there. And this document focuses firstly on remedy or remediation, and secondly on prevention and promotion. So for remedy and remediation, we have a burden of proof on an employer. So, you know, what we're doing is we're shifting the burden to the employer to say, can you prove that you paid the recruitment fees for this worker? And, you know, so for instance, in the work that we're doing now in Malaysia, Electronics Watch has got a variety of cases where we've approached companies, and some of the companies have clearly not paid for any of the recruitment costs, but actually some of the companies have paid. So they've actually given us evidence. Well, actually, we already paid the agent. We already paid the agent in Malaysia. But that doesn't necessarily mean the worker didn't pay if they don't regulate the process. But the burden should be on the employer to show that they did pay. And in terms of the worker, you cannot ever have a remediation process that requires receipts, because the worker will almost never have any receipts for the recruitment process. It's very much an informal process. And so we get the issue of the calculation. How much did the worker actually spend? And that is not an easy question to answer. And it really does, audits have really found that we find that audits have a limited use, because, as I said, because workers are forced to sign affidavits or video testimony in their origin country saying they didn't pay fees. And then if they come to their employer and then say, well, I did pay, they're worried they're going to lose their jobs, or they've been lying, and particularly when they've signed affidavits and the like. So it's really important that we calculate how much a worker paid. And in the Electronics Watch guidance document, we lay down some of the conditions which can be used there. For instance, using civil society organizations, worker leaders, local trade unions, including audits also, to try to work out an average amount that workers pay. And we really suggest this kind of average approach, because you can never work out exactly how much a worker paid, but you can try to work out how much an average worker in a batch from a particular country paid through a variety of different methods, and then that money should be remediated. So remedy and remediation is crucial because the workers are in forced labor situations, they're in debt bondage, they're suffering a lot in the conditions that they're facing. That's the primary thing, remedy, remediation, which we really still see very little of. And then we also have the prevention and promotion side. So, we need to be including in the contract terms, in bidding criteria, as ring-fenced costs, like the living wage. We need to be including these recruitment costs there. So to ensure the equitable sharing of costs between responsibility and burden between the buyers or public procurement agencies, in this case with Electronics Watch members, and the companies themselves. So, everyone needs to be prioritizing this issue of ethical recruitment. And then we have to look at capacity building versus pilot projects. I mean, in this issue of ethical recruitment, it's a global issue now, and it's something that a lot of money has been put into. There's so many programs, there's so many capacity building programs, there's so many projects that are working on ethical recruitment, but we still see very few pilot projects. So it's really important that we don't just do capacity building, and we don't just talk about this, but we actually start to do pilot projects, because it's not an easy thing to do. I worked in for 3 years, I've worked with one of the biggest seafood companies in the world to implement an ethical recruitment project with Thai Union, alongside one of Electronics Watch monitoring partners, MWRN, in Thailand. And we're really having so many challenges in implementing this project. It's not easy to do, because you're having to break down cultural barriers, whereby workers think that the more they pay for a job, the better the job will be, the more money they'll earn. And so it's a very difficult thing, and we need to start doing this kind of work. And we need to create an ethical recruitment market, and that's something that's very difficult to do, because you'll often find even the recruitment agencies that are willing to be ethical will only be ethical with you, and then the others, they won't be ethical because there's not a market there yet. So what is the way ahead in this area? It really is, I think Electronics Watch has made clear in our report on Kelcom, which I really recommend that if anyone is interested, you read the report. It's on the website, and the link was here. It's a 2.5 year study, which is ongoing. Is that the only way you can really solve these issues of recruitment fees, understanding how much work is paid and fixing the problem, is to have worker and community driven monitoring of the recruitment fees and related costs by independent civil society. That's really crucial, otherwise you really can't get the information that you need to move forward. And we need to have pilot projects as opposed to talking and training. That's something that's really important now to move this forward. And we also need transparency as to best practices and also challenges. This should be promoted, both for the remediation, when we have to pay back the money to workers when they paid fees, but also prevention and promotion. And we're really having a challenge here, because nobody is being transparent with the information. For instance, we have our RBA programs working, for instance, with Verite or with Elevate, two of the biggest organizations working on these kind of issues. And they're both doing a lot of projects on ethical recruitment, but they're all subject to non-disclosure agreements, and nobody wants to speak either about the best practice because they're worried that it won't be best practice or someone will find flaws in it. But they're also not willing to talk about the challenges, because it's very much linked with issues of forced labor, debt bondage. And the minute you link your supply chain with forced labor, debt bondage, you can have issues, particularly with customs and border protection in the US, etc., and modern slavery. So we really need more transparency, and we also need all supply chain actors to contribute, both in stressing, like Electronics Watch members stressing the importance of ethical recruitment, of responsible recruitment, of employer pays principle, supporting capacity building, but also when it comes down to the costs, thinking about what is the fair burden of costs if we're going to implement ethical recruitment projects, and who should be responsible for that. So that's just a brief overview of the topic, and I'm happy to take any questions, and hopefully Joseph will join us, but if not, I can also give some kind of improvised introduction to Malaysia also. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andy, and that was a really rich presentation, and I'm sure people have questions, but we do have really good sound news from Malaysia, from Joseph, and so we should turn it over to Joseph right now for his presentation. So Andy, you need to stop sharing, and then Joseph, you need to start sharing.
It's actually going to be me who's sharing because of the technical difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
So Joseph, can we just check your sound, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, fantastic. Okay, so just let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide.
Let me just open mine. Okay. Let me open the full slide. I don't seem to get the damn slide now. Okay.
Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint.
Fantastic.
Okay, you can go on to the next one. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Joseph again. Sorry about the technical problem. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about migrant worker recruitment in Malaysia. Before that, very briefly about Tenaganita, which was born out of the struggles of women workers in the 1990s. And we have programs on migrant protection, migrant rights, anti-trafficking persons, refugees, business accountability and responsibility. But I'll skip that now and go on to the next one. Now, why are we talking about migrant workers? Because in Malaysia, most of the workers, at least 1 out of 3 or 4 workers in whatever industry, consists of migrant workers. And therefore, it is important that we understand the process in which the recruitment takes place. One. Okay, you can go on to the next one. So I'm just going to quickly give an overview of the recruitment process because I don't go into the details of it. I just want to highlight the areas in which one we need to be careful about or pay attention to in order to avoid being complicit in unethical recruitment processes. So, the migrant worker, the overview of the process would be that you have, first of all, the prospective employer gets approval to get or to hire migrant workers. And then he usually contacts the local recruitment agent in order to find the workers. The local recruitment agent then contacts somebody in the host country to find or to induce or persuade workers to come in. Then the workers are interviewed and selected by the recruitment agency in that country, with or without the involvement of the employer. Sometimes the employer is there during the interview process. Otherwise, he will just leave it to the agent to do that. Okay. After that, they need to go through some formalities like medical screening. They need to go through some pre-departure training, get their documents done before they are able to leave for Malaysia. Now, once they come here, they need to be met by the employer and then taken on board. But before that, I want to say a few words about outsourcing. Now, in the past, we have had situation where local agents, employment recruitment agents, would hire workers under their own name and then send them off to factories as workers. In other words, these workers are actually treated as commodities. They just go there, they rent out the workers for their labor, they collect the fees, and then pay the workers whatever they think they can get away with. Now, this outsourced labor supply thing has been very prone to abuses, because often the employer holds on to the passport, they don't pay them the amount of wages that they promised, for accommodation, health issues, excessive working hours, and so on and so on. Now, fortunately, this system has actually now been stopped since the 30th of March this year, so that all employers, the real employers, have to actually put these workers on their own payroll. But of course, agents are finding other creative ways to get around it. Sometimes they come on as outsourced suppliers of services and make use of the same workers. So anyway, that's an issue that we need to pay attention to if we are trying to improve or clean up the recruitment process. Now, let me just go on to the next slide, which talks about the fraudulent and unethical practices that are found in the recruitment process. This actually is the core of a lot of the problems that we are facing in this space. I think people have talked about the excessive recruitment fees. Now, in most of the sending countries, the workers would be paying up to $500 US, and of course, it may not sound too much, but in their own currency, for their cost of living, it's a lot of money, which comes to maybe 16 to 20 months wages. And then they often, not often, all the time, have to borrow this money at an excessively high interest rate, going up to about 10% sometimes a month. Basically, then what happens is that the workers come here with a huge debt hanging over their heads, which makes them then bonded in a way. They are stuck. They are not able to leave the employer, even if they are being exploited. Now, the other problem area that we need to look at would be the incorrect or false information that is given to them in the course of their recruitment. Quite often, the information is misleading about their kind of work, the wages that they're being paid, the kind of accommodation that they've been provided, etc. Now, we need to check on the kind of information that they got before they came and when they come back here, when they come to work here. Now, the other point is about contract substitution. Now, from our experience, what we find is that most workers would be shown a contract, usually at the very last stage of the recruitment, maybe a day before they are about to take off in their plane, and they are asked to sign a document. And then when they come here, quite often, they are given another contract to sign. And sometimes the amounts, the conditions, the terms and conditions of the contract is quite different from what has been signed, if they do happen to have a copy of it, which quite often is not the case. Now, I think related to the question of high costs is that there is a whole network of agents and sub-agents that are involved in the recruiting process. And this therefore increases the costs and the likelihood of false information being given, because basically the sub-agents just get a certain amount of money per head that they recruit. Okay, now we need to look at the primary agent, the main agent that is employed by the employer, and then the harder part would be to identify the different levels of sub-agents that are involved in this process. And sometimes these amounts of money that is paid by the workers is also used to pay the local policemen, local government officials, as well as sometimes the recruitment office, the human resources officers within the employer company. And we have also found instances where there is collusion between the recruitment agents and the employers in order to deduct the recruitment fees from the wages. Okay, can I go to the next one? Okay. Now, there is also the concept of what we call a free visa, or in Malay they call it visa bebas, which means that the employer, the worker is not bound to any particular employer. Basically, he gets a visa under the name of the agent who acts as a nominal employer. But when the employer comes in, when the worker comes in, he finds there is no job. He has to go and find his own job. Now, this is illegal, but quite a rampant practice that we find here. Technically, it is illegal. It is illegal because the name of the employer that is found in the work permit is not quite the same as where he is working. Okay. I'll go on to the next slide that look at, which would be the issue of Memorandum of Understanding and bilateral agreements. Malaysia has signed a number of MOUs with government ascending countries regarding migration for labor. And these MOUs specify the obligations of each party, for example, the kinds of wages that need to be paid, how their contract is registered, and so on and so on. But these MOUs are not persuasive. They are persuasive only, they're not legally binding. Therefore, it is impossible to really enforce them. On top of it, almost all the MOUs that are signed, for some reason or other, are confidential. It is not in the public domain, and as civil society, we find it difficult to find what really is mentioned in those MOUs. This is something that we need to pay attention to, we need to work on. Okay, then going on to the next slide, which I think would give a list of recommendations that we would have. Now, the first thing is that we have been asking for one ministry to be in charge of this recruitment process. And we would like the Ministry of Human Resources to do it. Currently, we also have the Home Affairs Minister that is also involved in this. And we do not quite understand why we have two ministries looking at this. The only reason we can think of is that there is money to be made by both parties. So that is something that needs to be sorted out, and it's a process that is still in progress. Now, the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, when an employer asks for permission or for approval to recruit workers, quite often the numbers that is allocated is quite large. Quite often, it is not based on the actual needs of the particular employer, but on the money that can be made. So you find an employer being approved for 200 workers when he doesn't even have a factory to start off with. Or you might have a very small operation which requires only 20 or 30 workers, even less. And the question then is, what does he do with all these excessive workers? These are the ones that are farmed out as free labor, or not free labor, free on the basis of free visas to other companies. And then we are also asking for a bilateral agreement as opposed to MOUs, so that any kind of conditions and the terms and conditions are enforceable. Now, we are also working towards the principle of employer pays, which means that the worker does not have to pay any recruitment fees. We found that actually there are some companies that have already started doing that, and they even have refunded some of the recruitment fees that have been paid by the workers. The problem here is, to be frank, is that it is difficult to actually identify the amounts that they are paid, because as I mentioned, there is a whole layer of network of sub-agents, and we do not quite know who has been paid what. Then we are talking about the employment contract. We want to make sure that every worker has an employment contract in his own language. Okay, so therefore that brings me to a checklist of what we could look for when we are trying to make sure that recruitment is done in an ethical manner. The first thing, as I mentioned, is, are there employment contracts available in the worker's own language? Sometimes, quite often, of course, we find that the workers are not even able to read their own language. So what efforts have been made to explain the terms and conditions of those contracts for them? Then, of course, we have the situation of workers being found loitering around, being abandoned at the airport sometimes for days on end. So a good employer would make sure that the workers on arrival be picked up within 24 hours or even less, so that they are not just basically loitering around the airport or even subjected to different kinds of abuses. Now, the other thing is about travel costs. We need to make sure that the employees are reimbursed for the total amount of money that they have spent on traveling to the workplace. And quite often, it is not just the capital city, but there's a lot of expenses involved for a worker to move from his village to the capital city of the airport is before he comes to Malaysia. Then there is this post-arrival training for the workers to relate their recruitment experience, to make sure that they have been given the right kind of information, that they have been briefed properly about the kind of jobs that they have been done, that they will be given. So this is something that good employers do, that they really take the trouble to do a post-arrival interview to make sure that they have had a good experience. Then there is also the post-arrival orientation and training, and they need to be told about their wages, their benefits, their leave overtime. Quite often this looks obvious, but quite often workers are not able to tell you what their benefits are, how many days annual leave they have, how much overtime they should be working, or what is the maximum amount of overtime that they are entitled to work. Okay. We talk about the labor rights, their rights as workers, their freedom of association. That means they need to be briefed that they are free to join any union of their choice. Does the company then have a migrant worker policy? If they do have, similar to the gender policy, have the workers been actually briefed on this policy and what it means, how they can make use of them? And there is the question of the grievance procedure. Have they been told how the grievance procedure works? And then, of course, where do they get redress if they do want to get in redress? So I think that's about it for the start. I think we just want to stop here at this point, and then I can take questions if you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you for struggling through the technical issues and still giving such a informative and succinct presentation. We're going to go to questions and answers right now. We're at 5 minutes before the hours, and I think that we can take 5 minutes to do the Q&A. So over to you, Martina. Have you received any questions?
Yes, I have. Let me just bring them up. So, okay, so first of all, a question to Andy. You say companies have the right policies in place, but reality seems different from the policies. Is this right? And if so, why is there this discrepancy?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the companies have policies in place, but often we find that they're not monitoring the policies. So, for instance, maybe sometimes the real costs of migration are not worked out properly. So the actual real cost of ethical recruitment is not actually mapped out. So the money that they're paying is not sufficient. Or it may well be that they're paying money to an agent in Malaysia or in Thailand, who then doesn't pass that money on to the agent in the origin country. So it really is about the fact that they're not monitoring the policies, and also they're not understanding the situation whereby the workers are, as I said, they're forced to sign affidavits. They have a video evidence taken of them saying they're not paying. And so what the companies are saying, and Electronics Watch has experience of this in Malaysia now, we go to the companies and say, well, we found that all these workers are paying. And they said, well, when we spoke to the workers, they said they're not paying anything, and our audits haven't picked up any of this information. So they're not really utilizing these worker-driven, community-driven, civil society-driven monitoring mechanisms to find out the real truth of what's happening.
Thank you. And now one for Joseph. Joseph, what historical trends do you see? Is exploitation of migrant workers getting worse or better? Does it manifest itself in different ways?
That's a tough question because we have not been monitoring it over a long period of time. I can only talk about what we experience here, what we see now. And of course, many companies now talk about ethical recruitment. They talk about no recruitment fee policies, which was something quite alien, which is quite something we didn't hear about maybe a couple of years ago. But in terms of actually what is happening on the ground, I think, to be honest, we need to really monitor over time to find out whether it's getting worse. What we do know is that irrespective of what has happened in the past, there is quite a lot of areas for improvement where the policies are in place. I think what I would summarize it by saying that actually now many companies do have all these nice policies, which I think Andy was talking about, which is one step progress, if we want to call it that. But in terms of implementing it, we still have a long way to go. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, just checking I'm not on mute. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. And another question for Andy. No, sorry, that was the one I just asked. Can you share a practical example of how costs workers paid are calculated and remediation, if there was remediation?
Okay, I can give some examples of, I've done give some examples of, for instance, the work I've done with Thai Union as the first one, which was in Thailand. And that was not really a very successful process because it was made very complicated by the company. And therefore the workers really couldn't be bothered to engage with the company because it was made too complex. So in the end, the workers really didn't get that much money. And then I can give an example, for instance, and again, this is not specific to the electronics industry because the electronics industry is not, we've requested the best practice information, we've requested the information to engage on best practice, but they're not being transparent. But we also have a situation, for instance, in the Middle East with the construction industry in Qatar, where they've adopted the approach the same as what Electronics Watch is recommending in our guidance document for workers that are working on the 2020 World Cup projects to get refunded. So essentially you use a lot of different sources, audits, investigations, civil society organizations to try to come to an average fee that workers actually paid. And then you remediate based on that. But we do have information, as I said, that, for instance, in Apple's supply chain, there has been remediation by the companies that are supplying to Apple. But we really don't have enough detailed information on exactly how that worked. So we're still looking into that. And we're also working on a few cases now, after I was in Malaysia with Electronics Watch, to try to do some remediation in Malaysia also.
Okay, and maybe just time for one last one. Sorry, another's just come in. Okay, what are the most important things a public buyer can do?
Who's this for?
Everyone, I guess. Whoever wants to answer.
If I may go first, I think public buyers need to make sure that there is no forced labor or traffic labor in the whole supply chain. I think that's the most basic thing, and which means that they need to take the trouble to find out what's going on, what's happening on the ground, monitoring, auditing, and making sure that in the context of recruitment, I would say that the employers need to take an active interest and involvement in the recruitment process, because quite often it is left to agents, and then they really do not know what's happening in the source country, how much of money is being paid, for those people involved. So that'll be the first step, and then down the process of after recruitment, whether the rest of the management of workers is done in an ethical manner.
I just say very briefly that I think the public procurement agencies need to ring fence these costs, and it needs to be going into the contracts with the suppliers, where with a equitable sharing of the costs of ethical recruitment, because ethical recruitment is a profession and it costs money, although it maybe in some cases actually costs less than unethical recruitment for the company if they do it properly. So it really needs to go into the contracts. It needs to be monitored. It needs to be audited against. Public buyers need to stress the priority to their supply chain actors of ensuring ethical zero-cost recruitment, and there also needs to be some financial contribution.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions, but I'm not sure whether or not if there's time to ask them now, or do we send the answers via email?
Well, a few people have left, but the majority are still on. So I would say, can we spend 2 minutes more on questions, and then I will wrap up very quickly. So we spend another 3 minutes and then we wrap up.
Sure. Okay. So firstly, we're planning to audit some factories in Malaysia this fall. How do we deal with recruitment fees in an audit process?
Oi.
Can I go first on this? Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Just based on my experience, not in the electronics, but in the plantation sector, quite often the employer said, we do not know how much these workers paid. And basically they said they're lying when they said that they paid quite a lot of money. So what we did in our case was we did interview workers, different workers in different times, workers from different countries and from different locations, and the figures that were cited were more or less the same. So that to us was evidence enough that the amount that they're talking about is in fact true, right? I mean, there may be a variation of a couple of $100, $100 dollars, but generally the figures were quite believable. And so, in fact, the company then went on to actually remediate, that means to pay back these workers based on the amounts that we had been able to identify through our interviews with the workers. That could be one method of trying to figure out how much actually they have paid. Andy, you might have something else to say.
I just think, obviously the traditional audit approach can bring some information, but it needs to be complemented with triangulating evidence from, worker-driven and community-driven social monitoring of the situation. So engaging communities, engaging those who have the trust of the workers, not just inside the four walls of the factory, so workers in their accommodation, and civil society organizations who have contacts within those factories. So it can't just be a traditional audit approach, or it won't get the full information. And secondly, there needs to be some element of actually doing some kind of investigation in the origin country also, because particularly when, for instance, the factories that you're doing in Malaysia, maybe they're in the middle of a recruitment process from, say, Myanmar or Nepal, or actually Myanmar. So it would be good to actually complement the audits that you're doing in Malaysia with some kind of investigation in the origin countries to get the true information from that side also.
Okay, and the last question was to Joseph. Is there any trade union trying to organise or reach out to migrant workers in Malaysia?
The short answer is yes, we do have Electronic Workers Union, but the union is not a nationwide union because that has not been approved. What we have are what we call in-house unions. That means the workers in a particular factory, they're allowed to form a union and become members of the union. But even that is against a lot of odds, a lot of discouragement from the management. Yes, so yes, there are unions which try to organize the workers.
Any other questions, Martina?
No, that's it.
Okay, Joseph, I think just to clarify, there are unions, we know that, but I think the question was, are they reaching out to migrant workers specifically?
Okay, yes and no. For a long time, actually, unions have not been too keen on recruiting migrant workers into their fold, among their ranks. That's also because there's always traditionally been a certain amount of divisiveness between local workers and migrant workers. But the message is getting through to the unions that they have, in order to survive, they need to recruit these migrant workers. And so some of them are beginning to engage with these migrant workers and get them on board. But it's a long process, slow process. Not all unions are quite keen on that. But if they don't do that, though, that will spell the end of the unions, because majority of workers would be migrant workers. And if they not become members of the unions, then unions will have no place in the whole scenario. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it's a long question to answer, and thank you. It's based upon our experience in Malaysia and also other countries. Of course, workers are going to be quite scared of speaking up and of joining a union, and particularly workers are as vulnerable as migrant workers. So it's a very complex challenge that question points us toward. So I'd like to give a really warm thanks to our presenter, Joseph, Paul, and Andy Hall, who both of whom struggled through and succeeded against the technical challenges to give really wonderful, informative, stimulating presentations. And I'm sure that if you have further questions for them, they will be more than happy to engage with you online via email. Just let us know, send an email to Electronics Watch if you'd like to be in touch with them. I'd like to thank all of you for joining today, for engaging with us, for participating in these webinars. To remind you of next week's webinar already on worker voices in public procurement. Is there a role for public procurement to strengthen worker voices in your supply chain so that we are better able to detect, for example, when there is a migrant worker recruitment fees, debt bondage, forced labor in these supply chains. This whole webinar series is a part of the Make ICT Fair project. You see the little logo there at the bottom of your screen, which is also funded by the European Union. Finally, I'd like to say that to remind you that, like all the other webinars we do, a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the Electronics Watch website. And I see another chat coming in here, if there's something. Okay, and so it just remains, I will like to thank the presenters. Thank you all for joining again, and hope to see most of you again next week. Bye-bye.